My name is Jason Rice, and I'm recording this for Kelsey Townsend.
Sally?
Julie?
Erica? Joseph?
And Aaron.
Let us take a moment and imagine the ideal education setting. You may think of small class sizes, ample resources, great facilities, and dedicated teachers. This is something that we do not always have access to in the United States. Recently, there have been many budget cuts to education that have affected the education system. This is an important issue to take note of because it affects not only our teachers, but also our students. Today, I'm going to talk about education funding and why I think it is important for Oklahoma to implement a policy that will provide more funding for education. I will first compare our education funding to that of Finland, then explain how the budget cuts in Oklahoma have affected our students and teachers. Funding for education is limited and is continually limited further as time passes. It's easy to cut back on something that does not directly and immediately affect our lives, but that is the mistake we are making. Cutting back on education funding affects us now and will continue to affect us in the future. To begin, I'm going to compare how education is funded in the United States, particularly Oklahoma, with how education is funded in Finland. Funding for education in the United States is complicated and often unfair. The federal, state, and local governments all contribute to education funding. According to the U.S. Department of Education website, the federal government only contributes a small portion of the funds for education nationwide. In his article titled, "Putting a Number on Federal Education Spending," Jason DeLeese puts it into perspective. He explains that out of the $3.5 trillion the government spent in 2012, only $107.6 billion went towards education. Most of the funding for education comes from the state. The Center for Public Education website explains that traditionally, states and local communities are charged with delivering the majority of K-12 education revenue. Each state determines how much it will contribute to its schools' budgets, with percentages ranging from 32 to 89% of total K-12 funding. According to their chart, Oklahoma contributes about 50.2% to education funding. The remaining amount needed for education that is not provided by the federal or state governments is provided by the local government. One of the main sources of education funding from the local government is property tax. In their article titled "Inequality, Opting Out, and Public Education Funding," Kaylin Arcelin and Iona Chaput explained that wealthy communities have a higher tax base, which provides their schools with more funding. This is not a fair distribution of funds. Imagine your child going to a school with limited resources while your coworker's child goes to a well-funded school across town. This inequality is based on local funding. Why should your child miss out on a good education because of where you live? Every student should have the same opportunity to succeed. That is why I think a policy will make a huge difference. Now that we know how education is funded in the United States, let's take a look at how education is funded in Finland. Finland has developed an extremely positive outlook towards education, providing support and opportunity to all students. Funding for education in Finland is provided based on need by the state and local authorities. In his article, Stephen Tung describes the Finnish education funding. He says that Finnish schools are nationally funded based on the number of students. Schools are provided additional funding if they have a higher portion of immigrants or students whose parents are uneducated or unemployed. So instead of most of the local funding coming from unequal property tax, the funding is provided based on the need of that school. So if a student lives in a poor community, they are not forgotten. The Ministry of Education and Culture website says that most institutions providing basic and upper secondary level education are maintained by local authorities or joint municipal boards. Responsibility for educational funding is divided between the state and local authorities. This is similar to how education is funded in the United States. However, in Finland, they divide the funds amongst their schools based on the number of students and the need of that school. Education in Finland is a top priority and their teachers are highly esteemed. The National Public Education Support Fund website says that throughout their history, Finns have always placed a great value in learning, and teaching is comparable in both prestige and compensation to the practice of medicine or law. This level of respect is not always given to teachers in the United States. Finland gives a higher priority to education as well as a fairer distribution of funds. We may be able to learn something from Finland. The difference between education funding in the United States and Finland is obvious. The two differ in how they distribute their funds amongst their schools and in the priority education receives. Now that we know how education is funded in the United States and Finland, let's take a look at how the budget cuts in Oklahoma have affected our teachers and students. The decrease in education funding in Oklahoma is devastating. The News on 6 website says that state leaders cut $47 million from the education budget. They go on to explain that this will affect each district differently because some districts rely more heavily on the state funding than others. In her article, Melissa Kelly, a secondary education expert, says that budget cuts affect teachers, which will in turn affect the students. With the budget cuts, there have been teacher salary decreases as well as teacher layoffs. This has caused us to lose many passionate and effective teachers. Kelly also mentions that there is less funding for materials, delays in purchasing new textbooks, and less professional development opportunities for teachers. Not only that, but the class sizes are increasing as well. This causes the students to not have as close of a one-on-one relationship with their teacher. This may cause some of the students to be looked over or lost in the crowd. So with the budget cuts, teachers are losing their drive and students are not receiving the education that they deserve. This may cause some of the students to fall through the cracks. Education is something that we all know is important. However, we are not providing enough financial support for our education. We have all too often voted to decrease education spending in order to keep our taxes down. However, we are doing this without thinking of our children's futures. Today we have learned the difference between education funding in the United States and Finland. We've also learned the effects the decreased spending has on our teachers and students in Oklahoma. Our students are not receiving the materials and the support that they need. That is why I think Oklahoma should implement a policy that will provide more funding for students in education. Our number one priority should be teaching our future generations.